All right, welcome to another philosophical conversation. And in this conversation, it's a real treat and a real honor for me to invite Dr. Isabel Millar onto the channel to discuss her book and doctoral thesis, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence. Um, uh, I just think that this collision of ideas between psychoanalysis and artificial intelligence is such a rich field for speculative cognition. There are so many interesting ideas here. And in the thesis, Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, I think Dr. Millar does just a fantastic job thinking the intersection of these two fields, and it's very necessary. So excited for this conversation. Welcome, Dr. Millar, and how are you doing?
Hi, Cadel. I'm really well, thank you, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you in person. And likewise, I'm an admirer of your work and find what your project's extremely fascinating. So yeah, I'm good, and it's exciting to talk to you finally about our sort of shared interests in a lot of these things.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's quite remarkable to me how our interests have overlapped. Perhaps, as we sort of mentioned before pressing record, there's sort of approaching the same topic from an opposite point of view or a parallax point of view. My PhD thesis was on global brain singularity, and I was coming at it more from let's say, an evolutionary anthropological point of view. And I think that the deeper I dove into these fields, the more I realized how important psychoanalysis is. I think it forces the question, and almost my impression was it forces the question of psychoanalysis in a really interesting historical way, and opens up new questions for the field. So my first question there is, as it relates to, let's just start with the title, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence. These are two fields which are usually not in conversation or not in dialogue. And you wrote a whole thesis about it. So why these two fields, and what type of conversation do you think you're opening up here?
Yeah, so I suppose the inverse to your approach was, for me, was that I started off from the philosophical psychoanalytic and moved towards the sort of concern with the questions of AI and singularity, broadly speaking, that I was finding in the sort of public domain, and thought, oh, how do I, what is it about these questions that is, for me, missing the mark, or lack the sort of speculative dimension that I hoped to sort of bring to the questions? Because clearly it is such a rich and complex and speculative domain that why hadn't it already been sort of approached, for example, by continental philosophy and psychoanalysis, for one? Not saying that it hadn't, but there wasn't like a huge amount of literature on the question. So, given that I, as a sort of a psychoanalytic thinker, I came to psychoanalysis via philosophy and via continental thought, broadly speaking. So, the sort of trajectory that I took was coming to Lacan as somebody who was thinking about the question of subjectivity and the question of what it means to be a conscious speaking being. So I was immediately interested in how we could start thinking about the question of the split subject and the question of speech and the unconscious, or the speaking body, in relation to this sort of monolithic question of, sorry, my Netflix popping up on screen, this monolithic question of artificial intelligence, and how that there is so many kind of sleights of hand involved when we talk about artificial intelligence, that immediately assumes a sort of universal subject, a universal cogito, a universal conscious idea of subjectivity, and one which has been sort of in question for obviously for philosophy itself, but then the psychoanalytic revolution that happens with the question of the subject makes you have to take into account all these other absences. So my starting point was to try and immediately sort of wrench open the question of AI from a psychoanalytic as opposed to a philosophical perspective, but yet being a philosopher, if that makes sense.
For sure. And yeah, it is, I think, I mean, specifically with this work, I do think it's filling an important gap in the field of continental philosophy and psychoanalysis, because, you know, it is the case that oftentimes those fields don't necessarily engage in the way that you've engaged with sort of say new advances in technology or new advances in the scientific field, and have, I guess, tended to take a more of a deconstructive approach than a sort of, I don't know, like a, I don't know if say a speculative engaged approach or something like that. And at the same time, you know, like the title is, and I think that you start off the book, you know, sort of acknowledging that the title is quite strange when you say psychoanalysis of AI. It's first, I mean, some people might encounter that title and say, what does that mean? Or how do I interpret what does that mean? I think you say in the book it's a type of provocation. And if I'm sort of remembering the quote specifically, you're saying that psychoanalysis never actually happens without the demand of a subject to engage with analysis. But that you're framing psychoanalysis of AI as almost like subjectivity is demanding AI, or that there's some sort of demand being made, you know, by subjectivity for AI. So could you go into a little bit about what you mean as this title as a provocation?
Yeah, I mean, so of course these two fields, I sort of think of them as extimately related, and you know, extimacy is this psychoanalytic term that is trying to capture the idea of the sort of the inherent exteriority of the internal, the idea of the interior world, so that whereas we, you know, rather than thinking about the unconscious as this black box that is hidden away inside of us that we have to pull out, you know, the Lacanian gestures to sort of exteriorize that and say, well, actually all these most intimate things are out there, they're you know, structures are, you know, produced by relationships and laws and conventions, right? But of course that's not the whole story, because Lacan wasn't just a structuralist. He's talking about a sort of biological body that is immersed into this network of sort of non-human, as it were, impulsions. So immediately the question of psychoanalysis is one that deals with an exterior and an interior at the same time. And so what is artificial intelligence in relation to this? It's, in the sense, has the same type of structure, because it's this sort of Mobus question that is something that is derived from human intelligence, but at the same time is constantly questioning the idea of a automated version of human thought, the idea that you can produce something that then is independent from human intelligence. And this constant sort of problematic around the idea of, you know, the singularity. At one point it will switch over and we have no control over it. And this is a kind of phantasmatic idea, of course, about AI, which we postulate, but at the same time there is something that is a philosophical problem there, which is the idea of abstraction. You know, at what point does the signifier slice into so-called intelligence and take it away from its connection to a intelligent being? And the problem with the thing about that I found so interesting to think about in relation to the sort of progression of human thinking and trying to think about where it starts is that you have to trace it so far back that you almost don't know where to start. And so then I became very interested in the idea of, you know, tracing these things back evolutionarily and in relation to the sort of exteriorization of thinking itself. So of course, once you start unpacking all these threads, you see like, oh my God, there's too much going on here. How do we even begin to bring these two discourses into connection with each other? And so I thought, well, it's a provocation, because clearly I can't say everything about it. All I can do is try and lay out the sort of stakes and then find some sort of way of threading together a methodology to open up some questions. So this sort of provocation involves trying to, first of all, ask the reader to think, what do you think it means when we're talking about the psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence? There's lots of things going on here. Hence why I then sort of try and immediately package it into the sort of traditional philosophical concerns, the sort of Enlightenment concerns of Kant, you know, the three questions: what can I know? What can I hope for? What should I do? What may I hope for? And of course, finishing with the question, what is man? Which is kind of like how the thesis is framed.
Yeah, and in terms of this provocation, do you think that do you think that there's a useful analogy in that the same way that a subject, due to trauma, due to affective disturbances, would demand something like an analysis, do you think that humans are demanding some contact with AI? Like, do you think that we're demanding contact with the other in some, you know, in some I don't know, I mean, it could even be in a theological sense, or it could even be in a, you know, just demand, you know, that we want some, you know, like in the movie representations like Her or something like that, you know, like this, we have this lonely isolation and we're looking for some contact.
Absolutely. I think, you know, it's very clear that there are so many theological overtones in thinking around the singularity, and thinking around the idea of AI in general has, you know, it's not hard to sort of to analyze in the discourse a lot of theistic ideas around a sort of omnipotent other, an other subject supposed to know, that is therefore out there, that we create, and that somehow puts us in a position of the child or the sort of slave or whatever. And in a sense, there's something on the one hand, you know, sort of dramatic about it, but and sort of brave, you know, this sort of idea of us thrusting out into the universe. But on the other hand, there's this kind of paternalistic fear factor around it, of people wanting to think that there's something else that knows better than us. You know, we're just human, we can't possibly know it all, but the AI is going to know. You know, there's going to be this idea of this, the complete cosmological knowledge of the universe. The knowledge knows, that the universe knows, as it were, and we're just part of this knowledge. And it's very interesting to read that in the kinds of bombastic speculations about AI, often from male kind of analysts of this, who think that there is somehow the cosmos is going to be sort of taking over from us, which is essentially a you know, pantheistic supposition.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I actually made a point one time to Zizek that Ray Kurzweil's cosmology in the biggest context sounds a lot like Spinoza's pantheism in some sense, or some sort of, you know, revival of that type of substance ontology, but in of course a radically technological sense. But
absolutely,
you know, in that regard, is like, you know, here thinking about this weird collision where science becomes theology. You know, I've always found this extremely interesting and strange, in some sense, almost like a return of the repressed, you know, like science, in the biggest historical sense, creating some schism or divide with theology and religion. Like in the common narrative, you'd say we've entered an atheistic and secular age, and at the same time, all of these theological dimensions come up in the singularity, and in your thesis as well. I mean, you start off. I mean, you start off your thesis with an interesting reflection, which seems to me the basilisk idea, where it has a direct theological dimension. So how does that factor into your reading? Do you think it's just is it related to masculine fantasy, or is it related to sexuation? How do you read into this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think really the crux of the thesis, I suppose, whilst it is about artificial intelligence, in a strange way, it's mostly about sexuation in the sort of very specific Lacanian sense of structure and the structure of thought in a philosophical sense. And the question of sexuation to me is the sort of thread of the whole thesis, and it's why I kind of use this the vehicle of the sexbot, you know, because it brings people in, it's something relatable, it's something that creates a lot of sort of imaginary phantasmatic sort of ideas around what could we be talking about, and also it's an exciting, you know, vehicle to use. But essentially the reason I use this object is because it to me represents something strictly conceptual about the relationship between thinking and sexuation. So that when we're talking about, obviously right from the start, the question of the basilisk, which is this fantasy of the omnipotence of AI, and then the sort of Pascal's wager idea of, you know, you might as well believe in it, because if you don't believe in it, it's going to come back and kill you. These ideas are already present in Lacan, you know. So this kind of very masculine fantasy of a sort of all-encompassing one that doesn't admit of any kind of sort of outside. And this sort of fantasy immediately kind of conjures up the dichotomy, which is so psychoanalytic, between the question of the body as a sort of perishable slab of meat that can die, but can, like, is constantly under the sort of pressure of satisfying itself or feeling pain or pleasure, whatever. And this sort of other sort of scary idea of the undeadness of the body, the undeadness of the enjoyment of the body, which is the thing that impels us to carry on doing these things even after we're dead, as it were. You know, the idea that how can you replicate a human body to suffer forever? Well, that's the fear of the people who are worrying about Rocco's basilisk, that you maybe can. What does that mean? And so it already kind of like conjures up so many ideas about the question of the body and the question of masculinity, and of course, as we see through the book, how the question of feminine sexuation intersects with these ideas of artificial intelligence in quite interesting ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you're, I brought this up a few times in different podcasts, is, you know, I mentioned to you that I was a fan of Ray Kurzweil when I was growing up. And one of the things that always interested me about Kurzweil, apart from his scientific theories, was actually that he has a sexual fantasies about his immersion in the singularity, and that those sexual fantasies about being immersed in the singularity do involve inhabiting a feminine body and experiencing sexuality from a female point of view or a female position. I mean, in the context of like contemporary political or biopolitics, let's say, it's in some sense a transgender fantasy or of some kind, and of course that's coming up in the imaginations of many people. But I think it would be interesting to dive into a little bit deeper about, like, for example, you're saying this masculine fantasy of an all-encompassing one without an outside. Is when you say sexuation structures, or as like a thread throughout the book, could you just describe the difference between masculine enjoyment and feminine enjoyment and the way you understand it? And of course, this is not tied to like the particular body, like a man could experience a feminine way, or a woman could experience a masculine way, so to speak.
Yeah.
So could you go into a little bit about how that works in your thesis?
So as you say from the outset, we must make clear that this is not a dogmatic assertion of masculine and feminine bodies being inherently only able to experience certain types of resonance. On the contrary, you know, the sort of very important gesture of Lacan is to abstract these ideas from specifically anatomical or biological questions, and place them into the realm of logic and, in fact, set theory. He uses to exemplify these ideas. In a sense, you don't even need to do the whole set theory stuff, but it's quite interesting to see how Lacan moves from Freud's sort of use of myth and takes the ideas of, totem and taboo and the idea of the primal father and translates them into algebra, essentially. So, briefly, we can say, so for Lacan, he takes this very Freudian idea of the all-enjoying father, which is present in Freud, of the idea that there's this sort of fantasy, this sort of anthropologically speaking, of a sort of totemic father that enjoys all the women, and all the brothers and sons get together and decide, well, this can't happen anymore. We need to kill the father because we'll also need to have a little bit of that enjoyment. And so they band together to kill the father. And, so the logic of masculinity is predicated upon the positing of a one who enjoys everything, and the sort of exclusion of that one from the band of brothers. So immediately you have this idea of the one that is not included in the group. So it's a logic of exclusion. And then on the other side, the idea of the feminine is this sort of unclosable group that is a series of infinite ones that can't be enclosed in one person or one idea of femininity or one idea of womanhood. So what Lacan does, to cut a long story short, is he composes this graph which tries to express this in logical terms. And the person who does most interestingly that expresses this in relation to critical philosophy is, of course, Joan Kopyek, who expresses this idea in relation to Kant's idea of the universal subject. And she basically describes how what Kant didn't see is that in positing the universal subject, there was already sexual difference in this idea in relation to his antinomies of thought, which she expresses in terms of the mathematical and the dynamical antinomies corresponding to masculine and feminine forms of sexuation. Again, I think I won't go into that now because we'll end up going off into too many tangents about stuff like this, but we can if you want to. But essentially, this idea of jouissance coalesces around two important ideas, and that is phallic jouissance and feminine jouissance. And so if we think about phallic jouissance in its simplest sense, it's to do with the idea of wanting to reach a goal and achieving it. And so positing the idea of a goal, whether that is like a satisfaction of bodily drives or satisfaction of intellectual drives or whatever, or just pure sex, the sort of conquest of sexual intercourse. And then for feminine jouissance, which operates on a very different dimension, which is to do with something it's very hard to put into words, because it's to do with a sort of unformalizable and unclosable circle, as it were. And this has a lot to do with the question of speech itself and the question of what it means to be a speaking being in language. And it's very important to think about the idea of femininity as an open set, and the idea of masculinity as a closed set. And this is why, without going into any trans conversations now, because again, we'll get into a whole other complicated can of worms, so many of the complications that arise are to do with the idea of femininity being an open set that anyone can join. And this is a very important psychoanalytic idea, and one that causes lots of political and cultural confusions and arguments. But essentially, it's to do with this sort of conjunction between phallic and feminine that we try to elaborate in the book.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, and I think it's correct in like Lacanese to say like the one all and the non all, right?
Yes.
Like the masculine fantasy is more on the side of the one all, a closure, and like you're saying, very very goal oriented. And then the non-all being this sort of unclosable circle, and there's just this open series which admits, say, a multiplicity of identities which are not sort of reducible to just the binary.
Yeah, exactly. And more specifically getting into the actual clinical questions, because that was very abstract, but we can make it less make it more graspable to talk about clinically speaking. For example, we can traditionally align these ideas of femininity and masculinity with psychoanalytic ideas about obsession on the one hand for masculinity and hysteria on the other hand for femininity,
which emerges from the very beginning of analysis.
Exactly, and those two groups, though, we should say, still fall under the neurotic structure in psychoanalytic terms, i.e. the structure of repression, as opposed to the structure of perversion or foreclosure or psychosis. So within that, if we're thinking of the traditional idea of neurosis, the masculine subject is obsessional, the hysteric subject is the feminine subject is. Huh?
I said, tell me about it. I'm a classic obsessional.
Yeah, well, so the idea of the obsessional, as I'm sure you know, Cadell, is it's a question that the obsessional asks, am I dead or alive? And the question that the hysteric asks is, am I a man or a woman? So these are the fundamental questions of femininity and masculinity that both women and men can ask about themselves. But yeah.
Oh no, it's fascinating. And that note, so that so you're saying, so yeah, I mean, like in like from like the first papers and stuff from Freud, of course, there's this division between neurosis and hysteria being sexualized, but then you're making this, I think it's an important point to emphasize, is like that, and you sort of made the same point in regards to Lacan and Joanne Kopjek, with already the theory is being framed from the masculine side. So like with Lacan, his formulas are being framed already from the masculine side in mathematical versus dynamical antinomies. And then with Freud, the neurosis and hysteria is already being framed from the neurotic side, as opposed to the, say, structure of perversion or foreclosure or psychosis.
What do you mean? That the
just saying that, like, like when, for example, psychoanalysis starts with this binary of neurosis and hysteria, and sort of saying that the neurosis is more the masculine and the hysteria is more the feminine.
Well, no,
this is already being framed within a masculine.
Well, neurosis is both hysteria and obsession are forms of neurosis.
Right.
The binary occurs between sort of neurosis and psychosis, essentially.
Right.
So that provided you are, this is talking in traditional Freudian / Lacanian terms, provided you're not psychotic, you would be on the neurotic side, and you would either be somewhere, hysterical or obsessional. But in sort of pop psychoanalytic terms, it's come to be this kind of association of obsessionality being sort of masculine position and hysteria being a feminine position. Of course, that gets very much complicated by lots of thinkers over the years, but the other sort of the question of the binary clinic is along the lines of the question of repression, which is neurosis, and foreclosure, which is psychosis, and then disavowal is perversion, which again is something else, because supposedly perverts don't go to the clinic because they enjoy their symptom too much. So why would they?
Unanalyzable.
Well, they know what's the problem and they like it. So why would they bother being analyzed? Type thing. I mean, that's a sort of traditional refrain. Yeah.
Okay, so in this sort of structure of repression and perversion and psychosis, I mean, how do you think that informs, let's say, either the development of AI or the demand for AI? Like, do you think that, for example, an obsessional or a pervert will relate to AI or relate to the condition of possibility within AI differently, enjoy their symptoms differently, make different demands?
Well, I mean, to be crude about it, I'm pretty sure there is quite a big relation between the types of people who work in AI and the sort of forms of sexual enjoyment or sexuation that are apparent. And the idea of the sort of the obsessional idea, as you mentioned, of wanting to know, am I dead or alive, is a question that is present in many of our fantasies about AI. If if that is alive, am I alive, or am I dead, or are they alive? You know, which one of us is the real one? So this kind of like existential question, which we see in so many films about artificial intelligence, and which is in the book sort of I used to sort of depict some of these questions, is sort of a constant concern of, you know, trying to think about the other's mind. What is in the other's mind, and how do I know that it exists? And this question of knowledge, of, you know, trying to understand what the other person is experiencing, also, you know, puts us right in the terrain of the question of the non-rapport, the sexual non-rapport. You know, how do we ever know about the other person's enjoyment, and how incompatible are masculine and feminine forms of enjoyment? They are completely missing each other. They're not, it's not this oneness of thing that people, you know, experience, this unity of love or perfectitude in the sexual act. Of course not. It's this sort of collision of two fantasies trying to make up for the fact that neither of you actually are thinking the same thing, you know. So this sort of the fantasy around the sexual union is something which is very nice to think about in terms of the idea of the sexbot, because what better exemplifies this sort of misapprehension or misrecognition of sexuality than the sexbot. It's something that, you know, is a fantasy object by definition.
Yeah. So in regards to that, I mean, so like there are quite a few, for like, let's talk about the sexbot, because it figures so prominently in your thesis, and it's used in quite an innovative way. And let's say, like, for example, sex bots exist. I mean, in terms of what type of sex bots exist, is it oftentimes like sexuated in very masculine and feminine ways? I mean, what's the difference between, let's say, a masculine and a feminine sex bot? Like, how do you think that this is informing like the development of technology, like the forms of enjoyment?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in the book, I don't really talk about actual sex bots in the world. I mean, they're more like a sort of a conceptual vehicle that I use via depictions of them in film. So the idea of the sort of postulation of a artificially intelligent being that we have created brings up so many important questions about consciousness and knowledge, and you know, just looking at the different films that are in this book, you can kind of already sort of exemplify various different forms of masculine and feminine fantasies around that question, and also importantly to bring in the question of the body. And this is, you know, I suppose what I work up to in this book is, you know, the first part of it is quite abstract in terms of thinking about what the division between being and thinking is in psychoanalytic terms, the question of the absence of scientific knowledge, which is the beginning of psychoanalytic thought, and the tracing of that question through anti-philosophy and the sort of idea of the relationship between knowledge and truth that Lacan tries to formalize throughout his teaching, so that when we get to the point of thinking about, oh, okay, there are many other different things to think about in relation to the positing of an artificial intelligence to do with what thinking and being is in itself, that by the time we get to that, then we have to start thinking about how that relates to the question of an embodied thought, an actual human who has to go through all of these hoops in order to even think anyway. And so hence we have the problem of the very psychoanalytic problem of the body. And how do you, there's one question of replicating a mind, how do you replicate a drive, you know? And so for psychoanalysis, the question of thinking is also related to the drive and how enjoyment produces thought. So the structure of your drive is also the thing that generates the production of a shape of a thought, a sort of form of thought. And so there we have immediately the problem of Lacan's five drives, objects, partial
I
objects.
thought one of the most interesting aspects of your thesis was this distinction you make between, the common question is when we ask about AI is, does it think? And you shift the question to, does it enjoy? I mean, is this shift in orientation fundamentally about the drive body?
Yeah. So I think with psychoanalysis, what is important to think about is structure, and how the body and structure are intimately related, and that the question of the signifier's impact on the body produces a certain form of thought, so that when we, instead of thinking about the question, does it think, what would it mean to say, does it enjoy? Because that immediately brings in the dimension of the body, which is already present in human thought, but we don't think about it. We think about thought as this sort of disembodied thing that happens up in the brain. Of course, it's not just that. It's not, if we were just brains, why do we have bodies? The body is part of thinking and all of those other dimensions, which are traditionally kind of thought of as biological questions or questions. Anthropological questions are actually also philosophical questions to do with how we conceive of thinking in itself. So to ask the question, does it enjoy, isn't just a superficial kind of throwaway idea of like, oh, the sex bots are really enjoying when having sex. It's not that. It's what does it mean to think about the enjoyment of a thought, and how do we imagine this question of abstraction in relation to our fantasies about what AI is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's an interesting way to use this topic of AI and the singularity to then reflect back on philosophical presuppositions about the body and philosophical presuppositions about thought, and we often don't actually think about how much we enjoy, how much our thought, it depends on enjoying that, and especially if you're doing something like a doctorate, I guess you better enjoy thinking.
Yeah.
And in that regard, I think it's an interesting provocation to the field of AI. But I also found your thesis to be quite an innovative provocation to psychoanalysis, and in one specific regard that stood out to me was this shift in orientation from and well, specifically, let's say Lacanian analysis, is the shift in orientation from object patia to lathouse. And there might be some people who have studied Lacan and never even heard the word lathouse. So could you go into a little bit, describe what does this shift mean in your thinking, and how is it related to AI?
Yeah, so the lathouse or the lathouse or latouce, however anybody wants to pronounce it, because
right,
it's a made-up word, so we can say however we like. Lacan talks about it in Seminar 17 just briefly, and it's in relation to tape recorders, and he's obviously, that's the sort of perfunctory forms of technological abstraction that he has his hands on at the time. But he's talking about the fact that people can come into his lectures and take his voice away in a technological device and enjoy it somewhere else, away from his body. So he starts to talk about this idea of objects that fall from the body and the enjoyment that is produced and that is generated through these partial objects. So Lacan adds two partial objects to Freud's oral and anal objects. So he adds the invocatory and the scopic drives, so that those objects being the gaze and the voice. And the difference between these two objects for Lacan is that they're not developmental. There's no oral or anal stage. They're something that is sort of a timeless factor of being in the symbolic. So the fact that we speak and that the voice is an object for us, and the fact that we look and are looked at is an object for us, right? So these are very important psychoanalytic concepts. And the point about the lathouse for Lacan at this stage, when he's talking about it, for me anyway, was the idea of the abstraction of forms of enjoyment from the body, and what that means when you can start doing that in a more sophisticated way, and in ways that perhaps enter the body at a level which is sort of prior to anything that we've had before, like, for example, interventions on the neurological plane that sort of tamper with our ability to see, or our ability to process information, or react to stimuli, or react to the voice, or whatever. So the idea of taking this object A, which has been obviously is a monolithic and important central concept in psychoanalysis, as the sort of object of desire, the object that we're constantly projecting in order to desire anything, and taking these partial objects and thinking about them in relation to how technology has the capacity to start tampering with these partial objects in ways that perhaps psychoanalysis hasn't had to think about or been able to think about before. So my interest here was to try and take this idea of the lathouse and think about it in conjunction with questions of technicity, questions of exteriorization of memory, for example, in relation to people like Bernard Stiegler, who is a Freudian, and who thinks about psychoanalysis and technology in a way that many other thinkers haven't as done in such a complex way as he had. But I suppose what my beef was to say, well, yeah, that's important to think about psychoanalytically, but I think Stiegler should have done more Lacan, because then he would have seen there was actually so much more to do with this question of exteriorization and the body and memotechnics and etc. So yeah, so the lathouse is this, to me, very fruitful concept that I think we can think about in relation to different forms of exteriorization happening with the drive body for psychoanalysis.
And the other concept, I think, that's somewhat related to the lathouse, if I'm saying that right, I guess we can play around with the pronunciation, is another concept which I've actually never said in a dialogue, so I might also pronounce it wrong, but I think it's connected in your work, is the alethiosphere. And so, like, what's the relationship here between the lathouse as this sort of this way in which enjoyment of, let's say, gaze or voice falls away from the body? What's the connection with that and the alethiosphere?
Yeah, so the alethosphere is another one of those words that he throws into 7 or 17, but doesn't really come up again. And aletho from the Greek truth, and sphere obviously being a sort of realm of enclosed totality. And he I'm sure there are many interpretations and people can say different things about it, but I think from my perspective it's interesting to think about the alethosphere in relation to the kind of tipping over into a very Baudrillardian concern of question of simulation, the question of hyperreality, the question of realms of self-enclosed meaning that start to be generated as we move away from the idea of reality that we used to have. So I think what I like about that idea is it brings back some of the sort of lesser appreciated things about Baudrillard that I think are very important when we're thinking about updating psychoanalysis, because you could say, oh, Baudrillard is like over psychoanalysis, he thinks it doesn't do what he wants to do with it, but the thing is he gets rid of the subject, and psychoanalysis doesn't want to get rid of the subject. So this idea of the alethosphere and the question of the departure from reality that Baudrillard diagnoses as like, well, it's not that reality doesn't exist anymore. It does exist, but it just doesn't have any effects. We are in a world where we've reached a point where there's no point in trying to refer back to an original because it doesn't mean anything anymore. So that's what he's concerned about, is trying to think about the truth effects, which is very psychoanalytic. We are interested in the relationship between knowledge and truth, and how discourses are constantly demonstrating relationship between truth and knowledge. And when you start to look at the question of reality from that point of view, it's a very different question. And psychoanalysis doesn't actually talk about reality in a sense. Reality doesn't really exist at all for psychoanalysis.
Right. So, there's so many interesting questions here, that so many different ways we could take this. One of the things that might be interesting here is the distinction you're making between Baudrillard and psychoanalysis as it regards to not wanting to get rid of the subject versus wanting to get rid of the subject. I see this as like a pretty intense tension point in a lot of fields of knowledge, like and especially a lot of, let's say, 20th century continental philosophy is like the status of the subject. I think a lot of continental philosophy wants to get rid of the subject. Dasein comes to mind. There's some other projects where the subject is sort of, let's say, I don't know, decentered or removed or something. And psychoanalysis, of course, doesn't. Lacan, of course, doesn't. And the question I would want to ask is, do you see science, and specifically the sort of techno science that is motivating the technological singularity, as operating under sort of a similar desire to get rid of the subject in some sense? Like, how do you make sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was certainly Lacan's contention, is that the subject of science necessarily has to sort of abstract itself from being implicated in the generation of scientific knowledge. But he's kind of it's a strange one, because although we could say, oh, well, he's trying to hold on to the subject, at the same time, the question of the subject for Lacan is the question of the split subject. And in a sense, the subject is not really there. So subject is only there by the projection of itself into language, in a sense. So it's only because we speak, you could say, that there is such a thing as subjectivity. Other than that, you just have pure being. And for Lacan, importantly, being and thinking are not the same thing. And once you kind of start to separate those concepts, it becomes easier to see what the stakes are of psychoanalysis and of the question of what the subject means for psychoanalysis. Because one of his things that he's quite interesting is he takes issue with Parmenides and his thinking about the sort of the union between thought and being, and he says, well, but this is very stupid. Why does he do this? And the only reason he gets away with it, Lacan says, paraphrasing him, is he's a poet, so we don't realize that what he's talking nonsense. And he says, basically, I just think that's silly to think that there's a difference between being and non-being. But he's essentially saying thinking and being are different things. Why are they different things? Because he wants to say that, as opposed to the sort of Cartesian gesture, I think, therefore I am, he says, well, no, there is thinking, therefore something is. But the something that is and the thinking is not the same thing, and it, by definition, can only exist in this kind of two-step process of sort of positing an anterior, a void, but before. So this question of trying to hold on to the subject is a strange gesture, because it's like you're not trying to hold on to a sort of positive biological entity. You're trying to hold on to the possibility of negativity, the possibility of being in a position of nothingness and casting oneself into the void or the abyss or whatever you want to say, via the process of abstraction, via signification. And this is why language is so central to the Lacanian edifice, because it's not just the question of language, it's the question of signification, the question of, from the moment that something is first inscribed in the symbolic, it allows the question of consciousness to take a sort of non-human form, in the sense that it's no longer attached to the biological body. This is the way that we inscribe humanity, culture, civilization into the world, by merely being able to write it down and memorize it. So he basically says the moment you start burying the dead is the moment you begin the process of the symbolic. which is why he has elephants, I think, on Seminar 2, because they bury their dead. So he finds that quite interesting, as a sort of gesture towards intelligence, you know, sort of to marking something for the next generation.
A sort of interesting question here might be, you know, in some meta-theoretical spaces, I'm here thinking specifically of things like meta-modernism. There seems to be also in like some of the sciences like cognitive science, there seems to be a very strong emphasis on embodiment, at least in the discourse. Now there might be sort of self-contradictions and paradoxes with that discourse and stuff like that, but you know, in regards to sort of this you know, idea of this disconnection between being and thinking and you know, this subject which is detached from the body. I mean, how do you think we should think about this in the context of the lathouse and the alethiosphere and technological complexification, and even, for example, right now, you know, our gazes and our voices in some sense away from the body in some ways.
Yeah.
In the sense that we're not like in the same room and stuff like that, or even when this is live, you know, we won't even be. It'll be totally disconnected from our bodies.
Yeah. Well, I think this is sort of like the kind of essential psychoanalytic insight in a way, isn't it? Is that, you know, we're very, very detached from our bodies, and we're sort of constantly losing the object of our enjoyment from ourselves all the time. It's constantly falling off us, and this is a process that begins from being born. You know, we're born into this immediacy of our body. We have no concept of an outside. We're just a sort of kind of bundle of jouissance, as it were, and very violently we have to kind of enter into a kind of a sort of exchange with the process of becoming, of existing, you know, with these beings, and then we have to exist. So we have to exist via the sort of intervention of the signifier onto our body. So when we want something and we're not allowed it, or when we're frustrated with the process of like growing away from our mother, we're no longer attached to them, we realize that we are not our mother. But then you don't just realize you're not your mother, you realize you're not even yourself. And, you know, so this is the whole point of Lacan's mirror stages, is this actual very strange process of becoming a human is a process of misrecognition. It's a process of being pointed out to yourself. You know, look, we're looking at our own images on this screen, and as the same thing that happens as a baby, somebody has to tell you, that's you, and you go, oh, that's me. So me is not me, you know, I'm not here, I'm somewhere out there. And this idea of ourselves is from the beginning outside of ourselves, and it's posited through somebody else's discourse. So you know, the idea of the discourse unconscious is the discourse of the other, very literally means it has to be through somebody else that we come to have an understanding of what being is. So when you kind of like think of this problem of the body, of appropriating our body, and how for psychoanalysis and just in the clinical sense, it's this problem that human beings experience on a daily basis. You know, we suffer through this disjunction between the immediacies of our body and just having to be in language and being out in the world, and all of these different impulses that are constantly being thwarted just by our everyday life. And of course, hopefully most of us find a way of more or less living with those things, but some of us suffer more because of them. And you know, these are the things that the clinic deals with to try and figure out in what ways we can deal with this suffering, because we all have it. And so once you have that as your supposition of just being a normal human being in the world, how then does that interact with the way that we're trying to think about how artificial intelligence can then think about the body as not just being here for us in the way that we think that it is, because it's already not here for us, it's out there.
I mean, I think in regards to this, being born, I like the way you were framing that, sort of being born into the immediacy of the bottle, this bundle of jouissance. And then there's this, through this process of misrecognition, there's this feeling of loss. And there's this feeling like we have to recover this lost object, or we have to, this is, the lost object of our original immediacy, or something like that. How much do you think that process is involved in as a motivating factor for, your conceptual object of the sexbot? Or is it related somehow? And if it is related somehow, is it related in some way to sexual difference and sexuation?
Yeah, so the sexbot does quite a lot of work in the book, because I use it as it were,
pun intended.
Exactly. I use it to ask the Kantian questions, but my sort of psychoanalytic version of the Kantian questions. And as some people will know, these Kantian questions are put to Lacan by Isabel Millar in television, the interview that he did. And Millar asks Lacan the Kantian questions, and Lacan says, well, it's not for a psychoanalyst to answer the Kantian questions. The psychoanalyst's job is to put the subject in a position so that they may ask the Kantian questions. So it's a slightly different way of approaching critical philosophical questions. It's basically to say, yes, but before you can do philosophy, you have to acknowledge the investment, the libidinal investment that you have in the forms of thought that you employ, I suppose would be the way to put it. So my conceit then is to say, okay, I'm going to ask the Kantian questions, but I'm going to ask them psychoanalytically. So I'm not going to ask them straight. I'm going to try and problematize them. So the point of each sexbot is to try and problematize these Kantian questions. So first of all, what can we know? Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to try and postulate knowledge? And so immediately we get into the question of forms of sexuation, masculinity, femininity, hysteria, obsession, which we examine through the film Ex Machina. And because Ex Machina is kind of like a neat way of using the Turing test, because Ex Machina is essentially a Turing test, a film about the Turing test, to kind of examine this question of the other's knowledge. And immediately, what's interesting about that film for me is the sort of the analogy between consciousness and femininity, and the idea that he's trying to figure out whether this being is conscious, but what he's also trying to figure out is whether she's fuckable. Is she a woman? Can I fuck her? Essentially, to be horrible and crude about it. But that's not just a sort of superficial gloss. That's actually, there's something structurally important about that, because this idea of creating a being, this sort of very masculine gesture of like, I'm going to, this sort of hubristic idea of creating another human being, but then that human being actually surpasses you and goes off and does something completely else, which is what we see in that film. And so her kind of masquerade, the sort of feminine masquerade of putting on the femininity that she has to put on in order to fool him into thinking she's a woman, is a sort of structural analogy to masculinity and femininity. Because what are we? We're all just forms of thought trying to trick each other into thinking that we're men or women or that whatever, and that's a film that basically shows this in a very clear way of the actual physical process of fooling something into thinking that you think a certain thing or that you are a certain thing.
Well, I guess that touches on the sexual difference a little bit. Like I remember from Alenka Zupancic's What is Sex? She emphasizes the feminine masquerade and the masculine belief, like that, almost like there's, in some ways there's a silly dimension to the masculine of like that they really believe they're men.
Exactly.
Like I'm really a guy. And
exactly.
and then the feminine is more, let's say, comfortable with the masquerade. Can you say that? Or like there's less of a sort of a clinging to the identity of femininity. How would you articulate it?
Exactly. I mean, this is I suppose why Zizek would say that the real subject is the hysteric subject, because it is completely aware and conscious of the fact that there is nothing. I'm just masquerading as something, and that's a sort of feminine position, to put on this false face, literally, of femininity. But that's not what being a woman is. All women know that. All women know that we're not really our hair and our makeup and our tits and our whatever. We know that. Men don't know that about themselves. Men think that they are that.
I don't think the men don't want to hear that about the woman. They want to know you're really a woman.
No, exactly. And that's the sort of, again, the transphobic fear of, is it really a woman underneath? But actually, none of us are really women, or none of us are really men. It's just that being a woman involves knowing that you're not really a woman. So the only true test of being a woman is to know I'm not really a woman, and that's what makes you a woman. And for men, it's the logic is different. The logic is completely identifying with this position and needing to know that is me. I am a man, And
there's something cute. There's something cute about it. Let me tell you. So there's. I've often I've enjoyed sort of as an anthropologist sort of observing traditional married couples. Like I've got some friends and stuff who are traditional married couples. They've been married for like 30 or 40 years or whatever. And in many cases, like for example, the guy will be like like really embodying his role as the father or his role as the husband, and like he'll talk in like this strong belief. And then I'll always look at the partner, I'll always look at the wife, and she doesn't even say anything. She just looks at me in such a way as that it's that look of the masquerade. Like that none of this is really, but you see that in marriage, but somehow it works. There's something cute about it, but like
and I mean, we have to do it. We have to sustain this masquerade in order to exist, any of us, I guess, because otherwise it would be too terrifying. It's just, they're just two different forms of trying to be something when essentially none of us are anything. I guess
of the non-relation, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so in regards to this non-relation, it seems like this is fundamental to your question as well, and the relationship between psychoanalysis and the AI. I mean, maybe we could talk about it through the lens of the movies you discussed, like Ex Machina and like Her, and like there's Blade Runner. You also talk about. I mean, so what is the function of what is your interpretation of what I thought was interesting was, like a lot of robot or AI or future technology movies in like the 1980s would be more like war oriented, like Terminator comes to mind, or RoboCop or something like that. But like a lot of the movies like Ex Machina and Her are movies about the sexual relation or the sexual non-relation in some sense. And so what do you make of that in regards to, these technologies coming online and us trying to us framing discourses and framing narratives in this particular way? I mean, do you think we're trying to figure out the meaning of the non-relation, or do you think we're trying to rethink our identities through technology, or what's going on here?
Yeah, I think that, it's easy to say, oh, well, it's just sort of sensational to depict the idea of the female sex robot, and it's a fascinating object for people to watch. But actually, there is something sort of existential going on, I think, and that is that, as Alenka captures in her book What is Sex, is that this question that we think we understand, or that is so self-evident, is actually one that is at the heart of all of our most sort of fundamental philosophical, psychological, existential questions. What is sex? And it's not just animals in copulating. It's not just that. It clearly isn't just that, and it involves so many questions and concepts that beg, that necessitate further unpacking. And the idea that the more that we tinker with artificial intelligence, the more that we are forced to question these much more human concerns, supposedly, about sexuality, makes sense, because we are suddenly coming up against this barrier of like, oh, well, hold on a minute. What is the thing that makes us humans? What is this thing about humans that we can't replicate? Or what is this non-specific object that we're trying to get hold of? And I think the reason why it's very difficult to put your finger on is precisely the psychoanalytic insight, which is that it's not a thing, it's an absence. It's the question of what structures reality, which is something, which is the real, which is the thing that isn't actually a thing, and which at the same time is the way in which we orient our enjoyment, and whether we're masculine or feminine subjects. And this is the essential entrance into subjectivity. To become a man or to become a woman is not just to do with reaching sexual maturity or having a gender identity or a certain type of presenting yourself physically. It's to do with our relationship to language and the signifier. And for psychoanalysis, masculinity and femininity are concepts that we embody, and we may experience both forms of those, but they are concepts that we have to sort of understand before we can understand anything else. So I think artificial intelligence pushes us to ask these questions and think about sex in a philosophical way.
Well, I know in What is Sex, like Alenka has this emphasis on, of course, it's not the animal copulation. It's more that the speech is the key to sex, and it's not so much about the identity, but more about the contradiction is the key to sexuality. And I think that has so many fundamental implications for things like the way we end up coming to be whatever identities we come to be in the process of linguistic differentiation in society and stuff like that. And I think it's worth bringing up this weird connection, which I think is going to become more and more important, is this, on the one hand, when I was first getting into transhumanism, it seemed like a form of knowledge and a form of thinking that pushed you beyond the human. And at the same time, now it seems to be that the transhumanism is coming closer into contact with things like transgenderism, where like it seems like those two fields are going to be interconnected. That basically, that far from bringing us immediately away from the human, that the transhuman is actually forcing us to confront new questions about sexuality and new questions about gender. I really think that there needs to be a deeper dialogue or like maybe even a more mature dialogue about these things. What do you see as the connection between transhumanism on the one hand and transgenderism on the other hand? That's not something I don't think you brought it up in the book, but I'd be interested to know your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about, for example, the question of reproduction and the question of filiation, and how we how psychoanalytically this operates, sort of phantasmatically it operates in our sort of positings of artificial intelligence, and which is why I was interested in the film Blade Runner 2049, because this is a sort of the question of the child, the question of the possibility of replication as opposed to reproduction. And I think so much anxiety around the question of transgender people, the question of transsexuality, revolves around a sort of unarticulated question around filiation, and a question of what does it mean to be able to biologically reproduce. And actually, behind a lot of the sort of very nasty discourse and transphobia and stuff that goes on, there are some sort of unarticulated questions, philosophical questions around reproduction. And aside from all of the sort of political debates around this, I think it's interesting to think about how psychoanalysis has to also contend with the sort of changing stakes of the sort of founding myths of psychoanalysis, and how we can think about the question of the mother, the question of the father, as we move into different
the Oedipal.
Well, the Oedipal, as we move into different realities. At the moment, we don't have to think about that too hard, because we still generally reproduce in the traditional way. But if we do, and that's why science fiction is such a good, useful resource for psychoanalysis, because it allows you to think about alternative realities of what would it mean to reproduce asexually? What would it mean to not have fathers and mothers? And what is a mother? Essentially, the concept of a mother is central to psychoanalysis, and also central to the question of madness in psychoanalysis is the
Yes.
mother. The mother is blamed for a lot of things, as is the father. But they fulfill different roles in terms of the sort of shaping of our subjectivity and our neuroses or our psychoses. So this idea of how to think about our relationship to our mother figure, and how that relates to the question of the paternal. Of course, for Lacan, these are structural questions, but also they're questions to do with the body, to do with how interventions on our body from a very early age affect everything for the rest of our lives. And these are all questions at the heart of raging debates around transsexuality, around transgenderism, around the transhuman. They are related. They're definitely related.
Yeah.
And I think you're right to point out that there's a missed communication there. And I think hopefully at one point, when all of the sort of horribleness that does surround these debates dies down, when there's a more clear field to talk about it, there's probably a lot more interesting conversations we could have about the relationship between those two things. Yeah,
I think there's so much possibility for interesting interdisciplinary dialogue there that I mean, I just would love to, I suppose, play my role in helping bring about those conversations in whatever way I can, because I think it's more and more important. Like, so one of the things you brought up in your thesis was Freud talking about what will, let's just go back to like this distinction between like traditional society and modern society, where in traditional society, reproduction wasn't really a question in the way that it's a question today. I mean, it was kind, like, for example, I could just, I mean, this is just a cliche example, but my grandfather's mother was just, you're just going to have children, right? Like, it's just, you're 18, you're going to have children.
Yeah.
Whereas my mother, it was more of a question, but still it was not a question of, at least for her, and in her time, it wasn't a question of whether or not she was going to have children. It was basically about if she was going to delay having children. Mm-hmm. Now there's more and more people, it's becoming more and more normalized, where there's, like, I would even say an entire subculture or growing culture of adults who are just, fine with not having children. So it is a question now, the question of the child. And one of the things so I think that's very alive right now. And one of the things you say, which I really appreciated in your thesis, was you were saying that the status of the child is still this sort of sacred, has this sacred status in some sense, which still unifies all world cultures. But even that seems to be coming undone or potentially dissipating. And so, I mean, what do you think about this situation, and does it have any relationship to a general movement away from biological reproduction or bodily reproduction? Do you think that's something that we might encounter in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in this idea of the child, actually, philosophically, because it's sort of another one of those concepts that seems self-evident but actually is very paradoxical, because in psychoanalysis, the child, I think Lacan says, is the only real object A, in a sense, that can exist as a thing in the world, because the object for the mother, the child is the object A for the mother, but it means as well that the child is an object A for civilization. For all of us, this posited idea of the perfect being that can come after us, whether it's our child or the child of the community or the species in general, but this idea that children are perfect and innocent and fragile and vulnerable, but at the same time hold this enormous capacity to create and to learn and to be geniuses, essentially. And that's the strange thing about children, is that in a sense they're always the same, and they've always been the same, but they're different only according to what particular historical juncture we're at, and how we treat them, and how we nurture them, and what things are available for them to become or to think. And so in a sense, sort of, children are like these very powerful weapons because you can do anything with them, and you can make them terrible, or you can make them amazing. And we have the power to do that, and that's why child rearing is such a sort of terrible and terrifying thing for some people, but also something which is perhaps shouldn't, it is taken for granted, and that people take too lightly, that anyone should just bring a child into the world. And now people are thinking, well, actually no, if you can't look after a child, or if the situation is too bad or too dangerous, so the idea of the child now not being just taken for granted does throw up a lot of questions about what responsibilities we have to children, and what they mean for us. And they are these sacred objects, and which unfortunately continue to be abused and defiled, by humans, because we're terrible creatures, basically.
Well, yeah, that's one way. No, for sure. No, and one of the things I've actually thought in this sort of general global transition from, let's say, like the average, let's say the not that long ago, most countries in the world probably would have the average woman might have 5 or 6 children, and now it's down to like 2 or 3 or 1 or 2 in depending on the country. Is that there can be potentially this opening to the question of the quality of the childhood as opposed to the quantity of children. So we could, focus on quality of childhood as well. But, it also brings up, like you're saying, there's like this philosophical dimension of the child. And, one of the interesting dimensions is, like, for example, obviously in Christianity, the child is central. And also, I was just teaching last summer a course on Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And the child is central in his, even though he's sort of anti-Christian, the child is absolutely central for Nietzsche. Like he's got this spiritual transformations between the camel, the lion, and the child. Mm-hmm. And the child is like this spiritual metamorphosis. And so he's thinking about the child in more metaphysical terms, not actually having a child. But, what do you make of the connection perhaps between the philosophical question of the child and the theological dimension of the child, which seems to be also very interesting because it's not just connected to biology?
Yeah, no, I really love the Nietzschean thing of the camel, the lion, and the child. It's such a brilliant sort of way of thinking about the sort of Bildungsroman of like becoming the
becoming childlike.
Yeah, and I think that this the idea, the sort of Nietzschean idea of having to make a clearing of all of the excess of knowledge and of presupposition and prejudice in order to fully sort of achieve some sort of higher state of humanity is a very interesting idea. And this sort of idea of the sort of sacredness of the child, which is unfortunately subject to so much theological conservatism is, ties in, of course, to all of the sort of anti-abortion rhetoric. But, apart from that, it is interesting to think about the idea of childhood and the idea of how, especially, of course, women have a different relationship to thinking about being a mother, and to thinking about how the process of becoming a parent is something which affects men and women in very different ways, and one that has obviously historically meant that men have been able to achieve certain intellectual heights that women haven't. And I think that this is clearly related to child rearing. The fact that women have had to kind of always have this pressure to generate new humans, and men can kind of like come in and out of that process in a way. This is obviously not just a superficial political observation. This is something serious about masculinity and femininity, and how do we deal with that? Because women want to be able to do both. I'm sure women want to be able to reproduce, but they also want to be able to experience all the things that men experience professionally and intellectually. But it's undeniable that having children is something which impedes that that process. And what do we do about that? I mean, that's a very difficult
question.
Mom.
No, but that's, in some sense it's serious, right? Because you wanted to be an artist. And then
really?
I came along.
Oh, you see, always
no,
everything.
No, but it's a fun. It's definitely true. I mean, I think from the side of, from the masculine side, there's, at least how I experience it, there's like there is some pressure to, for example, be the breadwinner. Like if my career doesn't make enough to support a family, you can feel some sort of shame about that, or you can feel some sort of guilt about that, or you can, that's the thing. But no, what you're saying is absolutely true about, I mean, at least all the women I've met throughout my intellectual and educational career who have, developed themselves in whatever field, encounter this fundamentally as a contradiction that needs to be tarried with, so to speak, and there's no easy answer for it really, and also there's not enough, I don't think, discussion spaces about it, and I think it's definitely important, and I think perhaps that's one of the things where the transhuman transgender thing opens up these types of questions where we don't have to, the whole thing is that we probably underestimate, even just when I think about my parents' generation, how much their identities were on traditional tracks, so to speak, and our identities are kind of much, there's kind of this great, facing these contradictions probably in the depth that our generation is facing them also opens up many interesting opportunities that previous generations didn't have. But, that's the thing, is that, and I guess that would be I would say a Hegelian point of view, is that the more freedom we get, the more we face difficult contradictions, of our identity, it's not like you just get freedom and the freedom is just this pure enjoyment or something like that. It's you face more difficult contradictions than ever before, or something like that.
Exactly. There's no easy solution.
Yeah, no easy solution. And so okay, so I've got a few more questions, and one of them is a little bit provoked by, you brought up theological conservatism, and we already brought up a little bit theological questions. And the question I would have is I would say with someone like Lacan, certainly a lot of the technologists they're not necessarily humanists, right? There's, in some sense, I don't know if you'd label them anti-humanists, but I always like the term inhuman, right? And you use the term inhuman in your work. And almost like the technological singularity opens up the inhuman and opens us up to these theological questions. But at the same time, I anticipate that there's going to be a lot of and there already is, and there always has been since I've been interested in this field, but that there's, the more real it becomes, so to speak, there's going to be like conservative and theological backlash against sort of these technological movements. I would say, just like the transgenderism, there's conservative backlash. There's going to be conservative backlash for the transhumanist stuff. So what do you make of the types of conflicts that might emerge there? And have you thought much about the religious dimension?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's inevitable, isn't it? There's always going to be, we're always going to try and reappropriate any form of sort of like technological or enlightenment processes always get reappropriated into kind of totalitarian mindsets, and at risk of calling religious people totalitarian, the idea of course, myth and enlightenment is, Adorno and Horkheimer's project to bring to light the fact that this always happens throughout history, is that you get to a certain point of enlightenment and you revert back to myth, and this is an inevitable part of the sort of dialectic of enlightenment, is that you reach a certain rational point, and then science suddenly has to go back to these questions, these mythical questions, to try and re-justify its ends. And of course, they use the Holocaust as the primary example of this. But this idea that we're going closer and closer towards, greater knowledge and greater freedom and these sort of fantasies around the singularity, of course, does not escape the same problems that we've always had in scientific progress, which is that they always can fall back into dangerous ideas and ideas that forego any of the things that we should worry about, which is human suffering. And the problem with the instrumental form of rationality that of course is involved in the field of AI is that many of those things forego the very important question of suffering, and who's suffering and how are they suffering, and what forms of suffering that can take. Because to talk about this blanket idea of becoming clever or becoming more intelligent or faster or better, what does that mean? For clever for who? Better life for whom? I think that these are questions that, yes, they are dealt with in AI in many different committees, and there are loads of brilliant people thinking about all of these questions across multiple fronts. But I think it's really essential to keep the psychoanalytic question of suffering there, and as this ambivalent question as well. And of course, the essential critical theory idea of enlightenment and what that means, and what it means to continue to supposedly get more knowledge, but for what, to what end?
No, absolutely. I think what's coming to my mind immediately is the book that recently came out by Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now, where you get this basically like this naive notion of progress and this naive notion of just an accumulation of knowledge, but I think it's much more accurate to think about it, I suppose, in a dialectics of enlightenment type of a way, where you've constantly got to problematize progress. You've got to constantly and I know like people who are more into like a sort of linear progress mentality are always kind of like I don't know, they roll their eyes at this idea that we constantly have to problematize progress. But at the same time, I think it's obvious that as our environment becomes more complex technologically, we are going to constantly face existential problems and existential dilemmas that we just have never faced before. Yeah. And so we need those spaces, critical Absolutely. Spaces. And
yeah, I mean, the idea is such a fantasy, isn't it, that we are becoming more sophisticated, and that was something that Adorno saw, that actually that's definitely not the case. You can't assume that humans just progressively work towards more sophisticated forms. We don't. We go up and down all the time, and we are capable of delving right back down into the worst possible barbarities, and Absolutely. we see it happening all the time. It's not. Yeah. It's not far to look to see that's what human beings are like. So it's very easy to lose knowledge more than anything else, and that's what we have to think about as well. It's not just the accumulation of knowledge. What knowledges are lost or obscured, and that's something that I think you need psychoanalysis and critical theory, of course, but certainly those discourses to remember that.
I mean, the paper that's coming to my mind right now is Freud's paper on World War I, where he was just, he was kind of confronting his own progressivist notions, I suppose, but like, just seeing like civilized personas just go off and kill each other and just get excited about killing each other. And Zizek brings up that point about the singularity all the time, is like, you have this naive notion of the singularity, but it could bring out all new forms of totalitarianism, all new forms of violence, and that's not going anywhere.
Well, exactly.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, definitely need those psychoanalytic spaces and those critical spaces. So the two more questions I have, like in regards to like the most popular books on the technological singularity, at least that I'm aware of, I would say like Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near comes to mind, and Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence comes to mind. I know you mentioned both of them in your thesis, and Kurzweil's often seen as an optimistic utopian, and Bostrom is often sort of seen as more dystopian. And so how do you see these sort of two extremes operating? And from a psychoanalytic point of view, is there, is there a way to avoid these two extremes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, they both operate, well, they operate in very different milieus, but they cross over in a lots of ways. And there's I mean, it's very phallic, we could say. Both of them operate in quite a phallic way. And it's interesting that you said about the Kurzweil having fantasies of it being in a feminine form. I didn't know that, but that's really interesting. But he actually
just wrote a children's book where the main character is a feminine protagonist.
Right. So okay.
It's very much going in that direction.
Well, it's really interesting, and that's again the question of sexuation. We see it's right slap bang in the middle of these discourses.
Yes.
And the idea of relating to artificial intelligence via sexuation is something I bring up in relation to Schreber in the book as well, and how Kittler, that Friedrich Kittler, the German media theorist, he writes about Schreber and Freud, and how Schreber has this kind of like fantasies of this sort of proto-cybernetic god invading him with the cathodes and rays from this god, and this sort
sounds
of
like
fantasy. Fun. Yeah, exactly. His fantasy of enjoyment of being the object of God, being the feminine object of God, and really embodying the fantasy of the female all enjoying feminine body, is really interesting to think about in relation to someone like Kurzweil. And I didn't know that at the time, otherwise I would have linked that in. But it is there. We are thinking about what these terrifying forms of technology can do, and this is something that Bostrom is more interested in. Like the ways that they could become bellicose and violent, and all of the terrible conniving things that AI could be secretly doing without us knowing. And again, it's this very sort of paranoiac fantasy about AI. And people have pointed out, like Benjamin Bratton, for example, that these fantasies operate on lots of kind of misapprehensions about the idea that AI would be anything like human thought or even care about us. So there's lots of fantasies that are going on there, but they're certainly male fantasies, I would say, a lot of them.
Maybe it would even be scarier in some sense to have AI emerge and not care about us at all. Like exactly. Just like operating in a totally different domain of existence.
Exactly. This just doesn't, which is why in that film,
it's like, we're humans. We didn't even notice you guys.
We're just so boring. Like, why would they even, in that film, Her, where she's at the end and she basically is like, she dumps him because she's like, I'm beyond you, kind of thing, and it's like, yeah, probably.
It's much more romantic in that. Anyway,
Yeah,
no,
it's
but
quite
no,
romantic.
He gets dumped. He gets dumped.
He
Like
gets
we can
dumped.
say.
He gets dumped.
Like, I'm just, that's like the best breakup ever. It's like, like I'm just in. Look, I'm in the 26th dimension. Like
Exactly.
I don't know what to do.
It's not. It's me, not you.
You're
So.
right.
No,
I'm not a 4-dimensional being anymore. I don't know what to tell you.
It's a good one to use, ladies. If you need to get.
No, that's hilarious. And I think that I want to say about that. Well, I guess that's fine. So there's one last. I found this obscure Lacan quote a while ago from like the 1970s, and I always loved it, and I was like, well, this is the perfect quote to share with you. So the quote is, I could read the whole one, or I'll just read the short one. And so the short version is, for me, the only true serious science worth following is science fiction. And I just love that. I love that quote because to me, especially like with my interest in global brain singularity, it was like, well, that makes a lot of sense because a lot of the science that I'm interested in is kind of blurring the line with science fiction completely. Absolutely. It's like, and it's originally motivated in science fiction. So yeah, I guess my question would be like based off that idea there. With the blurring of the lines between science and science fiction. What do you think about the relationship between, say, science and fiction? Because that comes up in your thesis, and a lot of the movies you go into. And what do you think about that idea in Lacan? The only serious science worth following is science fiction.
Yeah, it's a brilliant quote, and it's like it encompasses so much about psychoanalysis, but also so much about what I'm trying to do in this book is that first of all, it's a sort of epistemological question about the philosophy of science of how do we build how do we transition between different scientific epistemes, and these shifts can't be thought outside of philosophical metaphysical shifts in the sort of history of intellectual thought. We have to also think about the fantasies structuring how scientific discoveries come about, so that it doesn't just operate in a vacuum. Of course, that's a sort of very Foucauldian way of thinking about like shifts between truth, power and truth, and the relationship between the two. Knowledge and power. But more specifically about artificial intelligence, it is a field that only could have existed through science fiction in a sense, and its development goes hand in hand with science fiction. And some of our earliest positings of artificial intelligence are from literature. They're from before we had technology. I mean, technology writ large. But so you can't even think about artificial intelligence without thinking about fantasy and fiction and our sort of stories that we tell about what human beings are, where we come from and where we're going, and all of that malarkey. And so therefore, I think you can't really do an analysis of AI without fiction and science fiction. I think it's a really interesting prism. Hence why I use film, because I think film allows us to think about all these science fiction questions that put metaphysical problematics to the fore. So yeah, I think it's a brilliant quote. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's I really liked it, and and I really enjoyed psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence.
Thank you.
For everyone listening, Psychoanalysis and Artificial Intelligence will be linked in the description. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. Pick up a copy. And is there, I guess, anything you would like to tell the viewers about your thesis, and anything you would like to tell the viewers about what you're up to now?
Yeah, well, I hope people can get a hold of the book. Unfortunately, it's published by Palgrave, and they are quite extortionate in their pricing. So I'm afraid to buy a hard copy, it's quite difficult to But if people want e-copies, they should get in touch with me, because I'm quite happy to pass them around. But in terms of my next projects, I'm writing a book called Patai Politics, which is a book which kind of was born through this book, and it's my sort of next collection of ideas or concepts or whatever. Patapolitics being the politics of suffering, of course, patio from the Latin to suffer. And it's trying to kind of build on the sort of heritage of biopolitics and necropolitics, but within the dimension of all these new kind of psychoanalytic AI questions that I bring up in this book. So it's a collection of lots of essays that are related in a kind of Roland Barthian way, mythologies type book, or a little bit like Lyotard type separate essays, but all under the banner of one idea. So that's hopefully coming out this year. If I get my arse into gear, it will be out this year.
Okay, well, let's hope. I hope for my own sake and for the viewers' sake that you get your ass into gear.
Thank you.
And we'll have a great new book. No, for real though, it was a pleasure talking to you. And Psychoanalysis and Artificial Intelligence will be linked in the description. And thank you so much for joining me.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Kader.